The whole town told her the castle was cursed, that no one who entered ever stayed. But Hannah Miller, 8 months pregnant and desperate for a new beginning, didn't have anywhere else to go. For just $5,000, she bought the abandoned stone castle overlooking Lake Superior, hoping to turn its silence into shelter. But on the very first night, her loyal German Shepherd Scout began barking at the frozen cellar floor. When she pried open the boards, she uncovered something hidden for over 70 years, and what waited beneath would rewrite the town's history forever. Before we dive in, tell us where you were watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. The snow fell endlessly over Duluth, Minnesota, turning every shape into silence. The wind from Lake Superior howled against the cliffs, its voice old and mournful, carrying the memory of every soul who had ever sought warmth and failed. A rusty pickup truck climbed the narrow hill toward Lakeside Castle, its tires struggling against the ice. Inside, Hannah Miller, 28 years old and 8 months pregnant, gripped the steering wheel as if the world might slip away if she didn't hold tight enough. Her face was pale from the cold, framed by strands of chestnut brown hair that escaped her wool cap. There was something fragile yet unyielding about her, like glass that had learned how not to break. In the passenger seat sat Scout, her 5-year-old German Shepherd, his sable black coat thick and glistening with melted snowflakes. His amber eyes, intelligent and watchful, followed every turn of the road. Scout had been with her since her husband's funeral 2 winters ago, when silence had become unbearable and the nights too long. He was loyal in that instinctive, wordless way only animals can be, the kind that sensed heartbreak and stayed without asking. When the truck stopped before the castle gates, Hannah let the engine hum a little longer before turning it off. The air inside froze instantly, and her breath rose in faint clouds. She looked up at the looming silhouette of Lakeside Castle, a weather-beaten structure of gray stone and Gothic spires half swallowed by frost. Windows gaped like blind eyes. The tower leaned slightly toward the lake, as though listening to something buried beneath the ice. The locals had called it cursed, a place of sorrow and whispers. But to Hannah, it was a refuge she could afford a chance to begin again. She opened the door, boots crunching into the snow that nearly reached her calves. The castle stood only 50 yards away, but the wind made it feel like miles. Scout jumped down beside her, shaking off snow with a low growl, then trotted ahead as if to test the path. "Easy, boy," she murmured, one hand pressed against her swollen belly. The child moved beneath her touch, a flutter of life inside a body that had known too much emptiness. The heavy oak doors of the castle creaked open after a shove. The hinges screamed in protest, and the smell of cold stone and decay drifted out. Hannah stepped inside, her boots echoing faintly. The grand hall stretched before her, high ceilings laced with cobwebs, a chandelier hanging askew, and a grand staircase that split into two curved flights like open arms welcoming her into ruin. Dust rose in soft clouds around Scout's paws. She set her duffel bag down and leaned against the railing, her breath catching. The space was eerily beautiful. Faded portraits lined the walls, stern men in naval coats, women in lace collars. One painting in particular caught her eye. A man standing by the lake, his face sharp and noble, with cold eyes the color of slate. The brass plate beneath read Captain Elias North, 1949. She traced the letters with her fingers, the metal chilled like forgotten grief. Somewhere above, a loose shutter banged against the wind, and she flinched. Her body ached from the long drive, but rest felt impossible. She lit an old lantern she had brought along the flicker, throwing gold light across the peeling wallpaper. The house seemed to shift in response, floorboards creaking under invisible weight, the faint drip of melted snow echoing through the halls. She told herself it was just the cold, just air settling after years of neglect. But the way Scout's ears twitched, the way his muscles tensed, it made her wonder. She found an old armchair by the fireplace and lowered herself into it, exhaling slowly. The wind outside howled through the broken windows, threading through the cracks like an old song. She thought of the people who must have lived here once, their laughter, their storms, their endings. "We'll make it home again," she whispered to the baby, her voice trembling. "But sure, this time no one can take it away." Scout patted over and rested his head on her knee. His warmth seeped through her jeans, grounding her in the present. She stroked his fur absent-mindedly, her eyes wandering to the staircase. At the top, the corridor faded into shadow, and beyond that, the faint reflection of moonlight glimmered in a broken window. Scout suddenly stiffened, ears pricked, staring toward the third floor. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Hannah followed his gaze. Nothing, only the faint sway of curtains and the sound of the storm. Still unease trickled down her spine like melting ice. She rose slowly, hands over her belly, whispering, "It's okay, it's just the wind." The baby moved again as if answering. She smiled faintly, weary, yet comforted. "You're safe now," she told them both, herself, the child, and maybe the restless spirits that seemed to breathe with the wind. She spread her sleeping bag on the floor near the hearth, feeding the fire with the few logs left beside it. As the flames caught color, returned to the room, soft amber hues that licked across stone and memory. Scout circled twice before curling up beside her, eyes still fixed on the staircase. Hannah lay back, feeling the slow rise and fall of her breath against the rhythm of the storm outside. Before sleep claimed her, she looked once more toward the window, where the moonlight painted faint patterns on the cracked glass. The castle groaned as though stretching after a long slumber. The sound was deep, human almost, and strangely gentle. Hannah closed her eyes and whispered, "You're not empty anymore." Then in the fragile silence that followed, the wind outside changed direction, no longer howling against the walls, but whispering through them as if answering her back. The storm had passed, leaving behind a morning so still that every sound seemed amplified: the drip of melting icicles, the faint creak of the castle's timbers, and the slow rhythmic breathing of Hannah Miller, still half asleep beside the dying fire. Scout, her German shepherd, stirred first. His ears twitched at something unseen, and a deep growl rippled through his chest. The air inside Lakeside Castle was colder than the night before, though the fire's embers still glowed faintly. Hannah rose slowly, one hand bracing her swollen belly. The child within shifted as if sensing her unease. Scout padded toward the grand fireplace, his nails clicking on the uneven stone. He barked sharp, insistent, not out of fear, but discovery. "What is it, boy?" Hannah murmured, walking over. The hearth was massive, framed with carved granite angels whose faces had long since eroded. Beneath the soot-streaked mantle, the stones looked uneven. One section bore a faint line, a ridge that didn't belong. Hannah knelt carefully, ignoring the pull of her belly, and ran her fingertips along the cold mortar. Something hollow echoed behind it. Scout barked again, tail rigid. "Okay, okay," she whispered. "Let's see what you've found." She fetched a small hammer from her toolbox and chipped gently at the mortar. Dust filled the air, sharp with the scent of age. After a few careful strikes, a loose stone gave way, revealing a narrow cavity behind it. Inside, wrapped in layers of brittle newspaper, lay a metal box tarnished and dented by time. Its lid was etched with faint letters barely visible under the grime. Hannah squinted. Elias North, 1949. Her breath caught. It was the same name carved into the portrait frame upstairs, the man with eyes like frozen steel. She brushed the dust from the engraving, her heartbeat quickening. She carried the box to the window where weak sunlight fell through the frosted glass. The metal felt heavy, colder than the air around it. Scout sat beside her, head tilted, as if awaiting permission to understand. Hannah pried the latch open, and the lid lifted with a reluctant creak. Inside lay a stack of black and white photographs and several yellowed envelopes bound by a frayed ribbon. The first photo showed the castle in its prime, gleaming towers, trimmed hedges, a group of men in naval uniforms standing proudly before it. At the center was Captain Elias North, unmistakable in his stance and gaze. He looked younger than the portrait upstairs, his posture commanding the aura of a man both respected and feared. But in this photograph there was something softer in his expression, a trace of sorrow beneath the sternness. Hannah unfolded the top letter carefully, mindful of its fragility. The handwriting looping and elegant spoke in the voice of another century. "If these words are found, it means truth has been buried longer than I intended." The fund meant for the widows of sailors lost in the storms of '49 was stolen not by outsiders, but by men within this town, men who wear respect like a mask. They will silence anyone who knows. I cannot risk my family. I have hidden the proof within these walls. The letter was signed simply, Elias North. The room felt smaller as she read, the silence pressing in. The idea that this lonely castle had once been part of a crime, one rooted in grief and greed, tightened her chest. She looked to Scout, who stared back with quiet patience, his amber eyes full of an intelligence that always startled her. "What do we do with this?" she whispered. The dog tilted his head, then nudged her hand, as if to remind her, "Keep moving forward." Later that morning, Hannah decided to seek someone who might know more about the castle's past. The nearest neighbor lived a mile down the frozen road, a small farmhouse surrounded by bare apple trees. She bundled herself in her thick parka, pulled her wool hat low, and called Scout to heel. Together they trudged through the snow, their breath forming ghostly trails behind them. The house belonged to Maggie Dalton, a woman in her 60s with a frame as thin as birch and eyes as sharp as ice. Her silver hair was braided loosely down her back, and though her hands were lined with age, they moved with a quiet strength born from years of solitude. When she opened the door, the warmth of baking bread and wood smoke spilled out. "You must be the girl who bought the castle," she said, her voice both curious and kind. "Yes, ma'am, I'm Hannah Miller," Hannah replied, brushing snow from her coat. I found something there. Something old." Maggie gestured her inside. The living room was cluttered with mismatched furniture and photographs of younger days, fishermen, children, and a man in uniform. Her eyes lingered on one frame in particular, a black and white portrait of a sailor smiling in front of the lake. "My husband," she said softly, noticing Hannah's glance. "Lost him to the winter of '72. Lake Superior doesn't forgive easily." Over tea, Hannah showed her the letter and the photographs. Maggie's brow furrowed as she read. "Elias North," she murmured. "I remember that name. My grandmother used to speak of him, said he tried to protect the widows after the storm took their men. But the town turned against him. They said he kept the money for himself." She handed the paper back gently. Looks like the truth was colder than the lake itself. Hannah felt the baby shift again, a small flutter beneath her palm. Maggie noticed and smiled faintly. "That little one's got courage just like its mother. Duluth's wind carries more than snow, you know. It carries memories and sometimes justice." The sun began to set, tinting the world outside in pale gold. When Hannah left, Maggie stood by the door waving as Scout trotted ahead. "Be careful in that castle," the older woman called. "Some secrets don't stay quiet once you wake them." As Hannah walked back through the snow, the castle rose in the distance, dark and immense against the fading light. Scout barked once, breaking the silence. The sound echoed across the frozen lake like a warning or perhaps a promise. When she entered the hall again, the fire had gone out, but the faint scent of old paper lingered in the air. Hannah looked toward the fireplace where a draft whispered through the hole in the wall. For a brief moment, she thought she heard another sound beneath the wind, a sigh deep and weary, as though the castle itself had exhaled after 70 years of silence. The afternoon sun never rose high in Duluth that winter. It hovered low and pale, casting long blue shadows across the castle's snowy courtyard. Inside Lakeside Castle, the cold had deepened, slipping through cracks in the stone walls like invisible fingers. Hannah Miller sat by the window, reading through the last of Elias North's letters, each word feeling heavier than the one before. Her breath fogged the glass, blurring the white expanse outside where Scout, her German shepherd, trotted through drifts of snow, chasing a sound only he seemed to hear. A knock shattered the silence, 3 hard raps that made the window tremble. Hannah startled, one hand instinctively over her belly. When she opened the door, a gust of frozen air rushed in, along with 3 figures. The man in front removed his fur hat and stepped forward, his expression polished, but his eyes calculating. He was Mayor Conrad Whitaker, a man in his mid-50s with thick silver hair and a sharply lined face that might have once belonged to a hero, but now looked sculpted by ambition. His voice carried a strange warmth, like a candle flickering before it burns. "Mrs. Miller, I presume," he said. "You've stirred quite a bit of curiosity moving into the North property." Hannah forced a polite smile. "I didn't mean to stir anything, sir. I just needed a place to live." Behind him stood 2 men in long black coats, each wearing identical scarves and blank stares. They were broad-shouldered, silent, and cold in posture, one older bald with a scar along his jaw, the other younger with a permanent squint, as if daylight offended him. Whitaker's eyes flicked around the grand hall, lingering on the fireplace. "Old places like this," he said, "tend to keep memories better than people do. But memories can be dangerous, Mrs. Miller, especially for someone in your condition." "My condition?" she asked. He gestured vaguely toward her belly, smiling with feigned gentleness. "A woman expecting a child shouldn't be burdened with history. This castle isn't safe. The foundation is unstable, the wiring old, the cellars flooded in parts. I strongly suggest you relocate before the next blizzard. Scout growled low, stepping between Hannah and the men. Whitaker's smile faltered for a split second. Fine animal, he murmured. Protective, though sometimes dogs bark at things we'd rather not see. He tipped his hat, motioned to his men, and left his boots crunching through the snow. As the sound faded, Hannah realized she had been holding her breath. That evening, the temperature plunged again. The castle seemed to groan under the pressure of the storm that gathered over the lake. Hannah wrapped herself in a quilt by the fire, trying to read, but her thoughts kept circling back to Whitaker's visit. How had he known she was here? And why care so much about an old ruin? Scout lay near the hearth, his head on his paws but eyes alert. When the first thunder cracked above the lake, he jerked up, ears sharp. Then he bolted straight toward the corridor leading down to the old cellar. Scout, Hannah called, grabbing her flashlight. Her boots slipped on the cold stone as she followed. The air grew damp and heavy with the scent of rust. She found him at the end of a narrow hallway behind the kitchen, paws clawing frantically at the floor, where several slabs of stone met unevenly. Beneath the dust, she saw the faint outline of a metal ring embedded in the rock. "What are you doing, boy?" she whispered, kneeling down. She pulled at the ring, and to her astonishment, a section of the floor lifted with a loud metallic groan, revealing a narrow stairway spiraling down into darkness. The air that rose from below was icy and ancient, smelling faintly of iron and salt. Scout whined softly, hesitant, then descended, first muscles, taut nose twitching. Hannah followed her flashlight, trembling in her hand. The stairs led to a chamber carved directly into the rock beneath the castle. It was larger than she expected, lined with old barrels, crates, and what appeared to be naval storage trunks. The beam of her flashlight caught something gleaming under frost, a rusted safe, half buried under broken boards. Hannah brushed away the ice, the metal flaking beneath her fingers. She turned the dial, tried the handle. It refused to budge. Scout barked, the sound echoing off the stone walls. She grabbed an iron bar from the floor and struck the lock until it snapped loose. The door opened with a shudder. Inside were folders wrapped in oilcloth, sealed envelopes marked with dates, and a small, leather-bound notebook. She flipped one open, scanning the faded ink. It was a list, names, addresses, numbers beside them, some crossed out, others circled. The heading read Widow's Compensation Distribution, 1949 to 1950. Another sheet bore signatures she didn't recognize except one C. Whitaker. Hannah's breath caught. Whitaker's name. She turned another page and saw handwritten notes referencing missing funds and containment of rumors. A sudden crash made her jump. The storm had broken above them. Wind roared through the old pipes like screaming voices. Glass shattered somewhere upstairs, followed by the wail of loose shutters. Scout barked furiously, standing between her and the stairway, as if guarding her from whatever now stirred within the castle's bones. The flashlight flickered its beam, dancing across the damp walls. In that brief stutter of light, Hannah thought she saw something carved into the stone above the safe, a single word etched by hand. Truth. She backed toward the stairs, clutching the folder to her chest. "It's okay, Scout," she said softly, though her voice trembled. The dog's growl deepened, low and steady, his fur bristling. She placed a shaky hand on his head. "It's just the past waking up," she whispered, trying to believe it. But as another gust howled through the castle, she could have sworn the air itself whispered back. The storm had not stopped for 2 days. Lakeside Castle stood like a frozen monument, its towers wrapped in snow so thick they looked carved from the ice itself. Inside, Hannah Miller sat near the fire, the documents she had found laid out across the floor like pieces of a puzzle. The ink had bled in places, but one name kept surfacing: Conrad Whitaker, written in the looping, elegant script of official signatures. Her hands trembled as she traced it. The man who told her the castle was dangerous had been the danger all along. The baby kicked beneath her ribs. "I know," she whispered to the child. "We're close." Scout lifted his head from where he lay, his amber eyes fixed on her as if he understood. Outside, the wind shrieked through the cracks of the old windows, carrying a low hum like a whispering choir. That night, she called Lucy Parker, a journalist she had met years ago when her husband was still alive. Lucy had been covering story about veterans' health care, then sharp-tongued, stubborn, and brave enough to print what others wouldn't. Hannah still remembered her, tall with dark curly hair, that never seemed tamed freckles scattered across her nose, and a voice that could cut through noise but turn soft when she spoke of truth. When Lucy picked up the phone, the sound of typing filled the line. "Hannah, I haven't heard from you in years. I need your help," Hannah said. "It's about Duluth, about the Widows Fund, what happened in 1949. I found proof. Whitaker's involved." There was silence, then the rustle of papers. The mayor, Lucy, asked, her tone shifting instantly. "Send me what you have." "I can't. It's not safe. You'll have to come here." Hours later, long after midnight, the faint rumble of an engine echoed through the blizzard. Hannah pulled her coat tight and stepped onto the porch. The snow hit her face like shards of glass. Through the white haze, headlights appeared slow and cautious until a dark SUV came into view. The door opened and Lucy Parker emerged, bundled in a parka camera slung over her shoulder, snow already gathering in her curls. Her face was windburned, her eyes sharp with purpose. "You weren't kidding about the storm," she said, forcing a grin. Hannah led her inside. The castle moaned with the shifting wind as Lucy set up her camera and laptop. "Show me everything." For the next hour, they worked side by side. Lucy scanned documents, photographed old letters, and uploaded them to an encrypted server. The glow of the laptop illuminated their faces like firelight in the dark. "This isn't just local corruption," Lucy muttered. "These signatures, these are state level." Whitaker didn't act alone. As if summoned by her words, Scout began to growl. The sound was low, warning, primal, his gaze fixed on the frosted windows, then headlights. Not one pair, but several, cutting through the storm from below the hill. Hannah's stomach twisted. "They're here." Lucy rushed to the window. Figures emerged from the storm men in dark coats, flashlights slicing through the snow. One carried a crowbar, another had a walkie-talkie pressed to his ear. "Whitaker's men," Lucy said grimly. "He must have known you'd reach out." She yanked a small device from her bag and hit a button. "Don't worry, backup's on the way." "What kind of backup?" "The kind that listens when a journalist calls in proof of government fraud." Lucy said, eyes glinting. "I sent everything to 3 networks and a federal investigator. Even if they destroy the papers, the truth's already out." The first blow hit the castle's front doors. Wood splintered. Scout barked furiously, placing himself between the women and the noise. Hannah's pulse thundered. Lucy grabbed her camera hit record and pointed it toward the entrance. The door gave way, slamming open under the force of the wind. Conrad Whitaker stepped in snow, clinging to his coat, his silver hair plastered to his forehead. His eyes burned with the intensity of a man watching everything unravel. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice steady but tight, "you have no idea what you've unleashed. Some truths aren't meant to survive." Lucy stood tall beside Hannah. "You mean the ones that ruin your career?" Whitaker's jaw tightened. "This town was built on silence. If you tear that down, everything collapses. Families, names, legacies." Hannah's voice was quiet, but it carried through the storm. "Maybe that's the only way to rebuild." Before he could reply, floodlights washed over the room from outside. Sirens followed a sound piercing and holy amid the wind. Men in federal jackets poured up the hill, their voices commanding, their lights blinding. Whitaker turned toward the noise, his composure cracking. "No," he muttered, "not like this." Lucy lowered her camera, whispering. They got the signal. Outside, chaos unfolded. The agents surrounded the vehicle, shouting orders. Whitaker's men dropped their weapons and scattered. Snow swirled in violent spirals as red and blue lights flashed across the ice. Whitaker staggered out into the storm, his coat whipping behind him until his figure disappeared into the white. Inside the castle, the air finally eased. Hannah sank onto the nearest chair, her body trembling with exhaustion. Scout pressed his head against her knee, and she felt tears burn her eyes. Lucy shut her laptop, watching the snow fall through the broken window. "You did it, Hannah," she said softly. "The truth's out now." Hannah smiled faintly, one hand resting on her belly. "Not me," she said, "him." She glanced at the portrait of Elias North on the wall, the painted eyes gleaming faintly in the light. He never stopped trying to be heard. The wind outside quieted as if the lake itself had exhaled. For the first time in 70 years, Lakeside Castle was silent, not with fear, but with peace. Spring came quietly to Duluth, as if afraid to disturb the ghosts the winter had left behind. The ice on Lake Superior broke apart in slow, gleaming fragments. And for the first time in months, Sunlight touched the towers of Lakeside Castle, no longer a ruin, but a sanctuary reborn. The old stones glistened like wet silver, dripping with meltwater that whispered against the ground like rain returning from exile. Inside, Hannah Miller stood by the window of the old library, now converted into a warm living space. Her face was paler than before, but radiant with a soft strength, her chestnut hair tied loosely, strands curling against her temples. Beside her was a wooden cradle, and in it, wrapped in a faded quilt, lay Grace, the child who had survived both the storm and the silence. The baby's tiny fingers curled and uncurled, catching the sunlight. Scout, her loyal German shepherd, now wore a thin bandage where his wound had healed. His fur shimmered darker along his spine, the sign of his age and endurance. He lay near the cradle chin, resting on his paws, eyes half closed, but alert as always. Every few minutes he would lift his head to check the window or glance toward Hannah, as if reassuring himself that all three of them were still safe. The castle, once a place of decay, now smelled faintly of fresh wood soap and bread. Volunteers had come from town to help rebuild it. Among them was Tom Anders, a local carpenter in his early 40s, with kind eyes and a frame broad from years of work outdoors. His hair was sandy brown with a touch of gray, and his hands bore the scars of a man who had built more than he had ever owned. He had been one of the first to arrive after seeing Lucy Parker's documentary on television. Couldn't stand knowing a place like this was left alone, he'd said, when he came to help, his voice low and genuine. Places that survive storms deserve to live again. Hannah had smiled her gratitude wordless. The documentary, The Castle That Remembered, had aired 2 months earlier, directed by Lucy herself. It began with drone shots of the castle under snow and ended with Hannah's trembling hands uncovering the truth. The story swept across America, an expose not just of corruption, but of endurance. It reopened the Widows Fund, restoring pensions to families long forgotten. Letters began arriving daily, some from widows who cried reading the names of their grandmothers on those lists, others from strangers who simply wrote to thank Hannah for reminding them that courage still mattered. Lucy, always the reporter, even in triumph, called from New York the night the film won its first award. "It's not about winning," she'd said. "It's about making sure no one forgets again." Now, months later, Lucy was back in Duluth, sitting in the same library with her camera once more, though this time her expression was softer. She had grown thinner, her hair a little longer, but her energy, the quick spark behind her green eyes, remained. She was filming the final segment of her follow-up, the reopening of the castle, as a community center and memorial. "We'll call it Haven of Grace," Hannah had told her. "For the widows, for the truth, for her." She glanced toward the cradle, smiling. On the day of the dedication, the townspeople gathered in front of the castle under a sky washed clean by spring. The snow had retreated to the edges of the lake, where it clung stubbornly, like old memories refusing to leave. Hannah wore a simple white dress beneath her coat, her cheeks flushed from the cool breeze. She stood beside Maggie Dalton, the elderly neighbor whose steady faith had been her first kindness in Duluth. Maggie's hair, once silver, now shone almost white in the sun. She leaned on a carved cane, but her eyes were sharp, glinting with pride. "You gave this place back its name," Maggie said softly, "and you gave the town back its conscience." Lucy stood a few feet away, with her film crew adjusting the microphone. "One more shot," she said. "Then we'll wrap." Hannah nodded, holding Grace in her arms. The baby blinked at the light, her gaze unfocused, but calm. Scout sat at Hannah's feet, tail sweeping gently across the grass. As the camera rolled, Hannah stepped forward to the new stone plaque set at the base of the old tower. She ran her fingers across the carved inscription, her voice trembling, but steady as she read aloud. "The truth never dies in the snow. It only waits for the spring of courage." The crowd fell silent. A single gust of wind rose from the lake, carrying the faint scent of thawed earth. Somewhere in that moment, Hannah thought she heard the echo of a man's voice, Elias North perhaps, or the echo of all those who had been forgotten. When the ceremony ended, Lucy hugged her tightly. "You know," she said, "if I ever have a daughter, I hope she's half as brave as you." Hannah laughed quietly. "Just make sure she has a dog like Scout. Courage runs faster when it has company." That evening, as dusk fell and the guests departed, the castle stood quiet again. Hannah watched the reflection of the setting sun dance on the lake's surface. Grace slept soundly in her cradle. Scout lay near the door, head lifted toward the sound of distant loons. The castle's shadows stretched long and no longer menacing, but gentle like old hands folding into prayer. Hannah stepped outside one last time before night. The wind was warm now, smelling faintly of pine and melted ice. She looked up at the towers glowing gold in the fading light and whispered, "We made it home." Scout gave a single bark, clear, deep, and resonant, its echo rippling across the lake like a benediction. For a moment, even the world seemed to pause to listen. When the last of the snow vanished from the stones of Haven of Grace, something invisible yet profound lingered in the air, a kind of stillness that didn't belong to the cold or the wind, but to grace itself. Hannah would often stand on the balcony overlooking Lake Superior, the child in her arms, and Scout lying quietly by her feet, watching the light spill across the water like a promise renewed. She knew now that what had happened wasn't just justice, it was a miracle, quiet and patient, the kind that only God can weave through ordinary lives. The truth hadn't saved her because she was strong. It had saved her because she refused to stop believing that light could bloom in the darkest places. Somewhere between loss and redemption, she found faith again, not in luck or chance, but in a divine mercy that moves through people like her, people like Lucy Maggie, and every soul who dares to rebuild instead of run. And maybe that's the message for all of us. Miracles don't always come with thunder or trumpets. Sometimes they arrive in the shape of a stranger's kindness, a dog's loyalty, a mother's courage, or a truth buried too long that finally finds the courage to breathe again. So if you're watching this right now, take a deep breath. Look at your own life, the places you thought were frozen forever. Believe that God is still working quietly beneath that ice, preparing your spring, because He always is. If this story touched your heart, share it, leave a comment, and subscribe to remind someone else that no winter lasts forever. And as you go, may the Lord bless you, guide your steps through every storm, and warm your soul with the same grace that brought light back to this castle and to every heart that still believes in second chances. Amen.